I'd just like to welcome you to our webinar this morning. This is the second webinar that we've done. We did one about 2 weeks ago, which was on street public robbery. Second webinar that we're doing is a series called Conservations on Crime. It's about carjacking. The theme of this particular webinar is to look at what the situation is with carjacking in South Africa. What is the distribution in South Africa? What are some of the causes of carjacking? Which are the high priority areas in South Africa that one needs to be focusing on? What are some of the trends? In addition to what are some of the factors that are contributing towards this particular crime occurring in particular police stations in South Africa? So that's what we're going to be focusing on. This is a conversation. This is a conversation not only between Chris and I, but we would also just welcome anybody to engage with us about it. The purpose of our webinar series on conversations on crime is that we feel that there is far too little being done to discuss the situation with crime in South Africa, to look at mechanisms by which we can start to target particular crime types and starting to make a difference in terms of what is happening in our country. So that's the purpose of the presentation. And I'm now going to ask Chris to start. He's going to be talking about what is carjacking and the trends, and then we will do some of the spatial analysis and show you what the trends are in South Africa. So Chris, over to you.
Okay, good morning. And yeah, it's about carjacking. This is a crime which really, according to my experience many years ago, this is a crime whenever you talk to foreigners, they will always refer to carjacking, because overseas people read a lot about carjacking. And when they visit the country, they see signs up which say this is a carjacking hotspot, and they are very worried about it. Even investors, they use these light delivery vehicles, which also fall under carjacking. What is carjacking? Well, there's the definition. People can read it later, but it is an unlawful and intentional forceful removal and appropriation of a motor vehicle, excluding a truck belonging to another. And I refer there to the definitions of crime of the SAPS. And it should be emphasized that the gross mass of the vehicle should be below 3,500 kilograms. Now, if you look at some technical details of vehicles, we will see that light delivery trucks and bakkies, a lot of our bakkies, and we now become a bakkie nation, actually falls below the 5,000 kilogram, and they will be included in carjacking. Now, carjacking, like truckjacking and also CIT robbery and drugs and a few others, are one of the most organized crimes in South Africa, because you don't just hijack a vehicle. I mean, you can get a few exceptions to the rule, but mostly criminals hijack vehicles for a purpose, and the purpose will usually be the runners will hijack this vehicle to deliver to the finger man, which will take it up to the higher echelons of the syndicate, because they want to clone these vehicles. Now, I think people all know what cloning, but it's, in short, it is where you change the vehicle to one which was ridden off in an accident or one which is now on the scrapyard, but you clone it to another vehicle. You can even clone it to another vehicle which is still in operation. The problem is then you will receive the parking tickets and all the tickets. But in any case, a lot of our hijacked vehicles get cloned. Some are exported across our border to neighboring countries, but were found in other countries far away, which was hijacked in South Africa. And then the older models are chopped up for spares, parts, engines, tires, mags, all of those. And then to be used as a getaway vehicle during robbery, especially CIT robberies, shopping center robberies, those kind of robberies, or as trafficking vehicles. When they traffic drugs or other commodities, they will use this. And why I also say it's organized crime, there will always be in any of those activities, cloning, exporting, and even the chopping up of spares, maybe that one the least, there's always involvement of state officials, either police officers, licensing officers, people at the border post. There will always be some of them involved in these activities.
Chris, just a quick question before we move on. In terms of the situation in South Africa, what proportion of the vehicles are being processed inside South Africa, and what proportion of them are being exported? You get this idea from some media that, most of the vehicles that are being carjacked in South Africa are actually being exported. But what is the sort of proportion? Have you got any idea?
There were some estimations in the past, and those estimations usually indicate that most of the vehicles leave the country. My view is that I think most of them are either cloned or chopped up for spares in South Africa, and that there may be a proportion that leave for overseas countries, but I think the emphasis is on cloning and chopping up. But maybe there's some of the participants which have a different idea, and I would like to hear about that. Weapons used during carjacking, I'm not going to spend much time on it. Most of the cars are hijacked with a firearm. The criminals or the suspects use firearms, 85.4%. And then by hand, people who just come and they say, listen, I'm taking this car now. And that will always also go with a verbal threat. You don't see the firearm, but I will kill you if you don't hand over the car. And then the motor vehicle there basically refer to where your car is blocked in by 2 or 3 other vehicles, and they then take over the vehicle. I also want to just highlight that you see if firearms play such an important role in robbery, and we will see in future webinars that it play a very important role. Now, if you take arms away of the public, and that's another debate which we maybe have to look at, the criminals, you won't take their arms. They will still be active and do these kind of things. This is the type of vehicle, not the make of the vehicle, because we don't want to go into the makes of vehicles, because that will depend on the market share mostly and so on. But when we look here, I must highlight one thing. Sedan, 60.7%, then buckies, 25.4%, taxis, 10.9%, and it goes down. There's even a mistake made because the police, this is police figures, which was released for 2019-2020, a few months ago. But you will see there's even mistakenly a few trucks, 161 trucks registered under carjacking. But what is interesting is many years ago, when I started at the police in 95, most of the vehicles were actually sedans or hatchbacks. And they were mostly taken in the more affluent suburbs of South Africa. If I think of Gauteng, they were taken especially, and it's all started in Gauteng. They were taken at Brooklyn, they were taken in Sandton and these places. Now there's a definite shift. The buckies have become more, and even taxis. In 2019-2020, the large full year of which stats were released, since then we had 4 quarterly releases, which is very nice, very detailed. But I don't just want to count all of those figures together and say that's now the figures for 2020-2021, because I think that have to be left to the police, to the Register of Crime Statistics to do. But in the last financial year, before COVID, this was just before COVID, it was only affected by 1 week of COVID, we had 18,162 carjackings. And this is the highest annual figure since the registration of this subcategory started in 001 and 2002. And it is 12.6% of all aggravated robberies. Now, I have made some calculations and I looked at the figures of the quarterly figures released. And if we didn't have COVID, which only had an influence on carjackings in that first quarter of last year, which was actually the first quarter of the financial year, which was April, May, and June, their carjackings reduced with about 50%. But in the 3 quarters after June, carjackings actually skyrocketed. If we didn't have COVID, we would be higher than this figure, according to my estimation, nearer to the 19,000. Now, according to Stats South Africa's victim survey, 78% of the respondents reported carjackings, which is quite a high reporting figure. It was higher in the past, it now starts to drop, but it is 78 is quite a high reporting figure. And then they take it, and according to the population figures, they then calculate that there was actually 99,000 hijackings in 2019-2020, which is very much higher It's about 5 times that figure there. But I can't agree with their way of calculating it. Unfortunately, I already wrote 2 articles to say I don't agree with them. But according to our calculations, nearly 24,000 would be more correct. So there's a difference of about 7,000 between 24,000 and the 18,000 which was reported to the police. Okay, there you get the trend. And as you can see, this 18,162 is the highest in all of those years, starting off in 3-4. I have the figure for 2001 and 2002, but the problem is that those figures were before the moratorium on crime statistics, and we take this as the official base after moratorium statistics. And there, this figure is the highest, and I think in this year it would have been even higher if it wasn't for COVID. Okay, the next slide, we get increase in carjacking. The largest increases of carjacking, and it was an average of 12.2%, was between the years 2012-13 and 2016-17. There was very significant increases. And this is with all the crime. The same is with murder, with street robbery that we did a few weeks ago. And with all the other robberies, you'll see this tendency that everything went well up to 2012, 2013, and then everything went haywire from there. Now, there were marginal decreases of 2.3% and 1.8% in 2017-18 and 2018-19, followed then by this last increase, which put us on the highest level of 13.3% increase in 1920. Now, the explanation for this is for the last year since 2012-13, our intelligence-based visibility, or the police intelligence-based visibility, is very low. The second one is, you could just look at the news yesterday evening about protest marches in Cape Town around General Vieri. Now, if you look at that, there is problems within crime intelligence and the management of SAPS. There's so much infighting, so much factionalism, that they don't focus on crime, as was done before 2012. Then the marginal decreases of 2017-18 and 18-19 is possibly due to the very same explanation, because we have heard last year during a webinar, we have heard the Shadow Minister of Security of the DA, Ms. Kula Barnard, actually told us that General Jacobs started to repair things in crime intelligence, and that must have been the 2 years. And now we have seen the latest fights and the removal of General Jacobs from crime intelligence. The largest decreases were in 4-5, minus 9.9%. That was just when the targets, the 7 to 10% targets, was implemented after President Mbeki asked for a reduction of violent crime, and that brought that first one. And then after that, there was a struggle to get it down, but then came the World Cup. And in the year before the World Cup and the year after the World Cup, starting with 09, 10 up to 11, 12, those years, we had very significant decreases of 7.1%, 23.9% and 10.7%, especially that one of minus 23.9%. Now, that was due to, number one, high visibility and focused visibility based on your analysis of the crime pattern, the time of the crime, why the crime is occurring in that place and time. That brought about that minus 23.9%. That I must emphasize, because we work with the organized crime here, as well as more focus by crime intelligence on the syndicates. A lot of syndicates were dismantled and arrested in those years because there was a fear on government side that hijackings may really be very negative for the World Cup.
Before we move on, I just want to go and show the information on the web portal that we've got for South Africa. This is the free viewer that you can get access to on our web portal. It shows you the crime statistics for 2019-20 as well as 18-19, and one is able to very quickly do selection of particular police stations, and one can select it at a provincial level or at a municipality, or you can select for individual police stations. But you can also look at the selection of the particular year. We've set it for the crime statistics for 2019 and 20, and you are also able to make a selection in terms of the different forms of crime that you would like to show on the map. So what we are showing on the map at the moment is the distribution of carjackings at a police station level in 2019-20 for the whole country. And the redder the area is, the more pronounced and the higher the number of carjackings happening in that particular area. So generally across most of the country, if one looking at it at a national level, what one sees is that most of the smaller towns, rural type police stations across the country have got very few carjackings. In fact, many of them have got zero carjackings. But the redness that you can see is in this vicinity here, which is the province of Gauteng. So it's generally focused in the metropolitan areas and the larger towns in South Africa, not so much in the rural areas. But if we now go and have a look at Gauteng, for example, and we just apply it and then zoom in on that particular area, one can very quickly see that there are particular areas where there are higher incidents of car hijacking than others within the Gauteng province. So if we were to look very quickly at, for example, the highest category, which is excess of 3,000 of the carjackings, one can see that if one then looks at this, 9% of these carjackings occur in a certain number of police stations. So if I now just sort on this particular field here, you can see that, for example, in Gauteng, the police station which has now got the highest numbers of carjackings is Mamelodi East, followed by Boysens, and then Moroka, and then Honeydew. Now, as Chris pointed out a little bit earlier, Boysen had been a particular police station for many years. That was the #1 police station when it came to carjacking. But this has now been surpassed by the number of carjackings that are happening in the Mamelodi area in Gauteng. Now, if we are to go and have a look at the situation in the Western Cape, and I just want to add the Western Cape and zoom in on that particular area. And there you can see a couple of police stations that are in the top category for carjackings in the Western Cape, and more specifically in the Cape Peninsula. And just by clicking on that, you can see which of those particular police stations they are. So one of them is Harare. The other one that we can look at is Nyanga. And in fact, Nyanga now is the #1 police station in the country in terms of the number of carjackings that have happened in that particular area. It's had 429 carjackings happen in the year 2019-20 in that particular area. So clearly the sort of trend that we're starting to see, which Chris has been mentioning a little bit earlier, is this movement from generally higher per capita income areas where you've got people that have got luxury vehicles, as an example, the move generally away from those particular areas to much more the situation being found within the townships of major metropolitan areas in the country. And when I do the analysis a little bit later, you can see that there are strong correlations between carjacking and many of the other violent and social fabric crimes that one finds in South Africa. So the situation that we are seeing in 2019-20 when it comes to carjacking is that there is an intensification of not only this crime but other crimes in the township areas of South Africa, which is something of significant concern.
If we can start here, this is the top 30 stations in South Africa in 1920-20. This is police stats again, the stuff that they release all the time. And we find Nyanga there with 383, then Mamelodi East with 230, and then we go down Philippi East, 214, and we come here to Boysens. Now, Boysens is at #4 now, but if you take Boysens only went down from position 1 over many years. Boysens were 10 or 12 years that we monitored these in the past when I was still in the police. Boysens were always the so-called hijacking capital of South Africa. But then at a certain stage, Moffatville, which was part of Boysens, were cut away from Boysens. So Moffatville was removed as a separate station from Boysens. And if you now take that 166 and you take the 206 here and you count them together, you will come very near to Nyanga. The first thing I want to say about this is actually, why does Booysens and even the station that break away from it, Moffat View, those two are still there in the highest ranks? And then very close by, you find Jeppe, which is also very close by, but you also find Mondior. Mondior is also on the slide. So it is like a large spot in the south of Johannesburg where this crime of carjacking is just continuing all the time. And the question is, why can't the pinpointing of crime, the crime mapping, hotspots, peak times, explanation, environmental explanation of this crime not be used to take that figures down? And my view is that those stations should be kept accountable so that the crime figures can go down. Then my last remark on this specific one is that where there was 19 townships stations in this top 30, we find what I call 19 township stations. I had a look at our report when I was still in the police of 2006. There were only 4 township stations. The stations in that year, about 13, 14 years ago, in that year, 2006 and 7, most of the stations were the well-to-do suburbs of Gauteng, like Brooklyn, like Sandton, and areas around Sandton. Now, the situation has changed. Now, I think one explanation is that we now have more focus on taxis, light delivery vehicles, bakkies, and then people which have moved to the suburbs, but now they are visiting families or relatives or acquaintances in the township areas. I think that must be the explanation. But I've also seen, when Craig have just highlighted that situation in Cape Town, I see that all of that stations border on the N2 highway from Cape Town to the Strand and Somerset West. And I can remember during the Khayelitsha Commission, there was a lot of hijacking that take place on the N2, and then that is registered in those stations like Nyanga, like Khayelitsha, like Harare, and Lingulethu West. So if one had finer detail, that would have told us a story.
Chris, I'm just going to show, this is Google Maps. What we have done is we've imported the police station boundaries into the Google Maps just to give you an idea of where Booysens is. So this is Booysens police station here, and next to it you've got Moffat View. So this is Johannesburg CBD area. So this is the area that we are talking about, which historically has had very, very high incidence of carjacking. And in fact, if you take the combined figures for 2019-20 for Moffat View and for Booysens, they are higher than in Nyanga. So this area remains a center of focus, or should be a center of focus in relation to carjacking. And as pointed out by Chris, you can see that there are significant road infrastructure coming through these particular areas. Now, I was reminded this morning that one of the academics that has done significant amount of research on different forms of crime is a guy called Professor Marcus Felsen from Rutgers University in the United Kingdom, and Ron Clark. And they put forward 2 critical aspects of how to try and explain some of the crimes that are happening in an area. One of them is called criminal pattern theory, which talks about nodes. And when you talk about nodes, it's transport nodes as an example. There are 3 critical aspects: nodes. They also talk about paths or routes. And in addition to that, is that there are edges. In other words, these are areas which are known to the criminal, and they'll be able to commit the crimes within those particular areas. So if one sees the environmental characteristics of the 2 police stations, Booysens and Moffat View, you can see that there are lots of paths running through this particular area. There are probably high numbers of nodes because of the number of people that are moving on a daily basis from these particular areas into Johannesburg to work. And in addition to that, from other police stations to the south, moving through on these major routes here. And as a consequence, this is where a lot of the hijacking is in fact happening. And because they're moving through those areas on a regular basis, the criminals have created very important mindsets. They have an understanding of this area, not only in terms of their escape routes as an example, but they also have a knowledge of how quickly they can get from the point of the hijacking to a particular place where they can drop off the vehicle with the next level of the syndicate in order for that vehicle to be cloned or to be chopped up and moved on. And so from a geospatial point of view, it's very, very important that we start to get a handle on not only where the crimes are, in other words, the hotspots, but in addition to that, where are the other points that are critically important in these chains? If we understand that, we can then start to tackle this crime in a way which allows us to do it in a more systematic fashion. So I just wanted to give you that perspective. Also, maybe just to show you what Nyanga looks like in terms of its geographic position. This is Nyanga police station here. Again, as Chris has pointed out, it's got the highway running through here, major roads running through here. And what's quite interesting, Chris, was that you know that Nyanga was one of the areas in the Western Cape that they had the highest incidence of COVID cases, especially during wave 1. And research that has been done in terms of the high incidence of COVID cases in this particular area talks exactly to the same things which relate to carjacking, and that is routes, paths, and edges. So Nyanga, because it is so accessible, it's got many different hubs from a transport point of view of people moving from all around these different areas. It's a major transport hub. They move into this area to get onto the taxis and then they move out. These are critical factors that the police in South Africa has to take into consideration in tackling this particular crime in 2019, 20 and moving into 21 and 22. So that's the situation with those particular police stations. So what I'd like to just do is just to show you what the web platform that we've got allows us to have a look at. So if we are to deselect all the information and zoom in on the whole country, so what we are able to do with this technology, and one of the challenges that we face in the geospatial community is making information easily available. It is made available so that it can be utilized by any user. It is not therefore GIS specialist or geospatial specialist. Anybody should be able to look at this information, get access to this information, engage with their CPFs to look at what can be done in that particular police station in relation to any crime, and maybe more specifically in relation to carjacking. So if we look at carjacking as an example and we say, let's just have a look at the high priority police stations. In other words, the top priority police stations, because these are the ones which have got the highest number of crimes happening in them. And then we go and have a look at some of the other crime statistics that we have got associated with each of the different police stations. So if you come across a situation where the circle here is 100% red, it means that there is 100% association between police stations which have got high incidence of carjacking and this particular crime. So if you look at these different charts that you can see here, and these are the charts representing the different forms of violent crimes, you can see that there is 100% association with aggravated robbery. In other words, very strongly street and public robbery, assault, GBH, attempted murder, carjacking, of course, 100% association, but also common assault and street public robbery, which is down at the bottom here. So those crimes in these police stations which have got high incidence of carjacking, they also had these other violent crimes. So giving you an idea that these high priority police stations are also being intensified in terms of a whole range of other violent crimes that are happening in that area. And if you go and have a look at, for example, social fabric crimes, common robbery, drunk driving as an example, sexual crimes, illegal possession of firearms, there is 100% association with police stations which have got high incidence of carjacking. They also have high incidence of these particular crimes. And if one then also looks at it in relation to property related crimes, malicious damage to property, 100% association. And what you are able to also look at is theft of motor vehicles. So all of these things are happening in a whirlwind of crime that is hitting these particular police stations in South Africa. We've got to start focusing on how do we use intelligence-based policing, targeted policing, as what Chris has been talking about, to bring about a change. And geospatial information gives us a detailed understanding of what are the crimes that are associated with one another and how we can bring about some form of change in addressing carjacking.
What should be done? That is not in order of importance, the different bullets there, I want to start off actually with the third bullet, which say crime intelligence should have a special initiative, and the organized crime units, a special initiative to bust syndicates. You see, organized crime, you should also start at the top, at the head of the organized crime, which is the syndicates, the people who order these vehicles, people who deal in cloning and in chopping up the vehicles and in exporting the vehicles. You have to get to those people, arrest them, identify them, get intelligence on them, and then to arrest them, because otherwise it will never stop. The runners, the people who are doing the hijacking down at ground level, they are just replaced. The moment you arrest them or they get shot during shootouts or things like that, they are just replaced by others. There are lots of other people who will replace them. So that's the most important thing, that crime intelligence have to get their act together, and the hawks have to get their act together, and together they have to get to the syndicates. Then the following one is that at station level, I would go to bullet 2 actually. And I did it also during street robbery. I'm a firm believer that if a police station know what crime is happening where, at what time, and the reasons why it is happening there at that time, they can do a lot with visible policing based on that information. In the years that I was still in the police, I went to Boysens, and the few people there that's doing the analysis gave me an explanation why carjackings is happening in a certain street at a certain time of the day. It was the distribution points of drugs. It was also a place where after certain hours, it became a red light area where sex workers were working. And that is where the hijacking took place. Now, I'm certain that if we go back to Boysens today, you'll find similar explanations. And if a station then do something about that, they can do a lot. And then I would go, and I also feel, and I don't know if they still do it, maybe they do it. I can say in the years of Commissioner Salebi, where that targets were very important, the 7 to 10% reduction targets, which many of my colleagues won't agree with. And when current Minister Kele was the National Commissioner, a lot of emphasis were placed on accountability. People were called to meetings, and if they don't do well, they were really taken to the cleaner. And then the last one is actually that information about carjacking, business robberies. It is extremely important that the hotspots and modus operandi information should be given to the public. The last that I have got modus operandi information was that they usually hijack you when you arrive back at home at your electric gate, or as the gate open, or they slip in behind you. And you've seen on Crime Watch and all of these programs, you've seen a lot of that. But I know that there's some other modus operandi. I was hijacked with a total different modus operandi 3 years ago. And I'm still wondering now, after 3 years, how many times this very same modus operandi was used. The fact of the matter is this was a very unique modus operandi. And maybe they are using it every day and the public won't know it.
Can I just add one other thought in relation to what we've discussed here? And it is something that you raised when we talked about murder a month ago, where the police used to utilize some form of hypothesis in relation to why a particular murder was happening. I'd like to also add that the police need to understand these aspects of crime. In other words, the theoretical aspects, and many people say, what has it got to do with a policeman, the theoretical aspects? Well, whether it be a hypothesis in terms of why crimes occur, one can start to systematically look at those and to look at how you can solve the crime. But the same thing here with carjacking. We talked a little bit earlier about the crime pattern theory, which is about nodes, paths, and edges, or the mindset area of criminals. But Felsen and Clark also developed a theory called the routine activity theory. And that theory talks about that there are 3 things that are required in order for a particular crime to occur. First of all, you need to have an offender, okay? Somebody that is going to commit the crime, and that person lives somewhere. You've also got to have a target. Now, a target is not always a victim. It could be that the car was stolen and you weren't there, and as a consequence, there was no victim, but it's a target, okay? And then also no guardians. Now, what's interesting about this is that when they talk about there being no guardians, your first thought is that this is no policing or there is no security guards. But they emphasize that it's not only about those structures that should be there in order to prevent a crime from happening, but it's also about the extent to which citizens contribute towards the stopping of crime. And the question then becomes, to me, is that if you think about an area like Boysens as an example, or let's say, for example, Mamelodi East, why isn't those sorts of things in place in order for us to bring about a systemic and sustained reduction of carjacking and other crimes in the country? Maybe you'd like to answer that.
Well, you see, at station level, there's supposed to be a few people, depending on the size of the station, which will analyze the crime on a daily basis. They will see where the crime have been committed. They will look at the time when the crime is committed, and they will then go to that hotspot at that time of the day and see what in the environment make it possible for the hijackers to hijack the vehicles there. Now, if that is followed very strictly, and that information is really be used by the station management to decide how they're going to handle this, then it can bring a large reduction. And one of the strategies that they can follow is actually to provide some of this information to the public so that the public can be aware, if I drive in this area, it's dangerous after that time, and I should not stop. That's also why your CPFs are there. The community police forums should, together with the police, use this information to decide what are they going to do in Boysens.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Chris.